The rescue party found the campsite at dawn. 3 men had sheltered there during the October blizzard. 2 experienced trappers and a greenhorn from St. Louis who'd joined them for the season. The greenhorn was dead, frozen solid in his bedroll, curled into a fetal position, hands tucked under his arms in a final desperate attempt to preserve warmth. One of the experienced trappers, a man named William Cross, was barely alive. Severe frostbite on his fingers and toes, hypothermia so advanced he couldn't speak coherently, unlikely to survive the journey back to the trading post. The third man, Angus McPherson, was cooking breakfast, not huddled by a fire trying to warm himself, not shivering in a blanket, cooking breakfast, bacon sizzling in a pan, coffee steaming in a pot. The 53-year-old Scotsman moving around his camp like it was a pleasant autumn morning instead of the aftermath of a killing storm that had dropped temperatures to 18 below zero. "You boys look rough," Angus said, glancing at the rescue party. "Coffee's almost ready." The rescue party leader, a man named Thomas Henderson, stared at the scene. 2 men in the same camp, same storm, same night. One dead, one dying, one perfectly fine. The dead men had built a fire that had burned through the night. Angus had no fire at all. His fire pit was cold, hadn't been lit since before the storm hit. "How are you alive?" Henderson asked. Angus gestured toward a flat area near his shelter, a rectangular arrangement of stones, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, covered with a buffalo hide. "Stone bed. Heated it yesterday afternoon before the storm. Stayed warm all night without fire." "Stones kept you warm in 18 below?" "Aye, thermal mass. Stones hold heat for hours after fire's gone." "Those 2, Angus nodded toward the dead and dying men. "They tried to keep fire burning all night. Wind kept blowing it out. They froze between relights. I slept warm on stones that remembered yesterday's heat." Henderson looked at the stone arrangement. It looked primitive. It looked like something a caveman would build. It looked like absolutely nothing compared to a proper fire or a proper shelter. And it had kept a man alive through a storm that killed 2 others 20 feet away. Angus McPherson was 53 years old in the autumn of 1847, which made him one of the oldest active trappers in the Rocky Mountains. He'd come to America from the Scottish Highlands in 1819 at age 25, fleeing the clearances that were driving Highland families off their ancestral lands. He'd trapped beaver for nearly 3 decades, surviving conditions that killed men half his age, and he'd done it through knowledge passed down through generations of Highland survival. The Scottish Highlands weren't as cold as the Rocky Mountains, but they were cold enough, wet enough, and harsh enough that survival techniques had evolved over centuries. Highland shepherds and hunters had developed methods for staying warm in conditions where fire wasn't always possible. Nights when rain was too heavy, wind too strong, fuel too scarce. One of those methods was the heated stone bed. Angus had learned the technique from his grandfather before emigrating. The old man had called it Leia Beid Tlach, stone bed in Gaelic. You built a fire on a bed of flat stones during the day, let it burn for several hours, then swept away the coals and ashes, covered the heated stones with insulating material, and slept on top. The stones, having absorbed hours of heat, would release that heat slowly throughout the night. No fire needed, no fuel consumed after sunset, no risk of sparks or flames during sleep. When Angus arrived in the Rockies and saw how American trappers slept, either maintaining fires all night or shivering in cold bedrolls, he was surprised. The stone bed technique was common knowledge in Scotland. Why didn't Americans use it? The answer, he'd learned over the years, was cultural. Americans saw fire as essential to warmth. No fire meant cold. The idea of heating stones during the day and using stored heat at night seemed backwards, primitive, unnecessarily complicated. Why go through all that effort when you could just keep a fire burning? The answer to that question was lying frozen in a bedroll 20 feet from Angus's stone bed. Keeping a fire burning all night was easy when conditions were good. When conditions turned bad, when wind rose, when fuel was wet, when snow fell so heavily that flames couldn't survive, fire-dependent men died. Angus had known this would happen eventually. He'd warned William Cross and the Greenhorn, whose name was Samuel Patterson, about relying solely on fire. He'd offered to show them how to build a stone bed. They'd laughed at him, called it old-timer superstition, said they'd been sleeping by fires their whole lives and didn't need lessons from a Scotsman about staying warm. Now Samuel Patterson was dead, William Cross was dying, and Angus was cooking breakfast on stones that still held a trace of yesterday's warmth. The October trapping season of 1847 had started well. Angus, Cross, and Patterson had established camp in a high valley with good beaver water and plentiful game. The weather had been mild for early October, cold nights, but manageable. Patterson, the greenhorn, had been learning quickly, and Cross had predicted a profitable season. Angus had spent his first afternoon in camp building his stone bed. The other two watched with amusement as the old Scotsman gathered flat rocks from a nearby creek bed, hauling them to his chosen sleeping spot, arranging them in a careful rectangle. "What are you building?" Patterson asked. "Bed." "A bed? Made of rocks?" "Aye, stone bed. We'll heat it with fire, sleep on it at night, stays warm for hours." Cross laughed. "You're going to sleep on hot rocks? You'll burn yourself." "Not hot, warm. Fire heats stones during day. Sweep away coals at sunset. Stones release heat slowly through night. By morning, stones are cool, but you've slept warm entire time." "That sounds like a lot of work when you could just keep a fire going." "Fire can blow out. Fire needs constant fuel. Fire leaves you cold if anything goes wrong. Stone bed has no moving parts. Cannot fail." Patterson shook his head. "I'll stick with my bedroll. And a good fire, thanks. No offense, but sleeping on rocks sounds uncomfortable and unnecessary." "Your choice, lad. But when weather turns bad, you'll wish you had stones holding yesterday's heat." The stone bed Angus built was approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, big enough for one man to lie on comfortably. The stones were flat river rocks, each about the size of a dinner plate, arranged in a single layer with minimal gaps. He'd selected stones that were 3 to 4 inches thick enough to hold significant heat, thin enough to heat through completely. The arrangement sat on bare ground that Angus had cleared of debris and leveled carefully. Around the stone bed, he'd built a low wall of additional stones, about 4 inches high, creating a shallow rectangular basin. This wall would contain the fire and ashes during heating and would provide a windbreak once the bed was in use. Over the stone bed, Angus built a simple lean-to shelter, poles leaning against a horizontal ridgepole, covered with pine boughs and bark. This shelter wouldn't provide much warmth by itself, but it would block wind and precipitation, protecting the heated stones from heat-robbing air movement. Cross examined the construction skeptically. "That's a lot of work for one night's sleep. Stones stay in place, build once, use many times. Every night I'm in this camp, I heat these stones. Every night I sleep warm without maintaining fire. What if the storm blows down your shelter? Stones still hold heat. Shelter is convenience, not necessity. What if it rains and the stones get wet? Water conducts heat faster than air. Wet stones would still be warmer than cold, wet ground, but shelter keeps stones dry." Cross had no more objections, but he clearly thought the old Scotsman was wasting effort on an unnecessary complication. He and Patterson set up their bedrolls near a fire pit they'd dug, the standard American trapper arrangement. They'd keep fire burning during the night, taking turns adding wood, and sleep warm between duties. It was a system that worked until it didn't. The blizzard arrived on October 14th without the warning signs that usually preceded major storms. The morning had been clear and cold, frost on the ground, perhaps 25 degrees, nothing unusual for mid-October in the high country. By noon, clouds had moved in. By mid-afternoon, snow was falling. By sunset, wind was howling through the valley at 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Angus had heated his stone bed during the early afternoon, building a substantial fire directly on the flat rocks and letting it burn for 3 hours. The fire consumed a considerable amount of wood, perhaps 40 pounds, but this was the only fuel Angus would need for the night. By 4 o'clock, when the storm was building but not yet severe, he'd swept the coals and ashes away, laid a buffalo hide over the heated stones, and covered that with wool blankets. The stones were hot, too hot to touch directly. The buffalo hide provided insulation and protection from direct heat. Within an hour, the surface temperature had moderated to perhaps 110 degrees. Warm, but not burning, perfect for sleeping. Cross and Patterson were less prepared. They'd gathered firewood during the day, but not enough for a night of continuous burning in severe conditions. When the storm hit with full force around 7 o'clock, They had perhaps 4 hours of fuel stockpiled. "We'll gather more in the morning," Cross said confidently. "Fire'll keep us warm tonight." But the storm had other plans. The wind was so severe that flames couldn't maintain themselves. Every time Cross or Patterson built up the fire, wind would scatter the burning wood, extinguish flames, blow sparks into the darkness. They tried building wind barriers with their packs and blankets, but nothing worked. The fire died, was relit, died again, was relit again. By midnight, they were out of dry fuel. The wood they'd stockpiled had been buried under drifting snow, soaked through, useless. Cross tried to venture out to gather more, but the storm was too severe. He couldn't see, couldn't navigate, nearly got lost returning to camp. They huddled in their bedrolls, shivering, hoping the storm would break before they froze. Angus, 15 feet away under his lean-to, slept warm on his stone bed. The stones had been heated to perhaps 400 degrees during the afternoon fire. Even after 8 hours of gradual cooling, they were still above body temperature, perhaps 95 degrees by midnight, 85 degrees by dawn. The buffalo hide and wool blankets retained the radiant heat, creating a cocoon of warmth that required no maintenance, no fuel, no attention. He woke twice during the night, not from cold, but from the noise of the storm. Each time he checked that his shelter was intact, then returned to sleep. The stones beneath him felt like a heated mattress, gentle warmth rising through the layers of hide and wool. He was comfortable in conditions that were killing men a few yards away. The storm broke around 5 in the morning. Wind dropped, snow tapered off, and the first grey light revealed a transformed landscape. Everything buried under 2 feet of fresh snow, drifts piled 5 feet high against obstacles. Temperature at dawn was 18 below zero. Angus rose, shook snow off his shelter, and began building a fire for breakfast. His stone bed was finally cool. After 14 hours, the stones had released all their stored heat, but he'd slept warm the entire night. He felt rested, functional, ready to assess the situation. Cross and Patterson's camp was a disaster. Their fire pit was buried under snow. Their bedrolls were soaked, frozen stiff. Cross was alive, but barely functional. He'd spent the night in a semi-conscious state of severe hypothermia, shivering so violently that he'd torn muscles. Patterson wasn't moving at all. Angus waded through the snow to check on them. Cross was conscious but couldn't speak coherently, couldn't stand, couldn't help himself. Patterson was frozen solid, dead for hours. He'd likely died sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning when temperatures hit their lowest and his body could no longer maintain core heat. "Damn it," Angus muttered. He'd warned them. He'd offered to teach them. They'd laughed at him, and now one was dead, one was dying. He dragged Cross to his shelter, stripped off the man's frozen clothes, wrapped him in dry blankets, and rebuilt the fire. Cross needed warmth immediately, active warming from fire, not the gentle, radiant warmth of stones. It might already be too late. Frostbite had clearly claimed several fingers and probably toes. Whether Cross would survive depended on factors beyond Angus's control. Patterson was beyond help. Angus covered the body with a blanket and focused on keeping Cross alive until rescue could arrive. The rescue party found them mid-morning. 5 men from a camp 15 miles away had set out at first light, knowing the storm would have caused casualties. They'd expected to find Angus dead. He was the oldest, most vulnerable to cold. Instead, they found him cooking breakfast, while 2 younger men had failed to survive the same storm. Thomas Henderson, leading the rescue party, couldn't process what he was seeing. "Explain this to me. You had no fire last night. Those 2 had fire, or tried to. You're fine. They're dead or dying." "How?" Angus pointed to his stone bed, still visible under the lean-to. "Heated stones yesterday afternoon. Stones held heat all night. Slept warm without fire." "That's not possible. Stones get cold. Everything gets cold when it's 18 below. Stones get cold slowly, very slowly. 300 pounds of stone, heated to 400 degrees, takes 12, 14 hours to cool to air temperature. During those hours, stones are warmer than air. Lie on warm stones, stay warm." Henderson walked over to examine the stone bed. He touched the surface. Cool now, after 15 hours, but he could see the logic. Mass holds heat. Enough mass, heated hot enough, holds heat for a long time. Why didn't they build one? Didn't want to. Said it was too much work. Said fire was easier, said they didn't need lessons from an old Scotsman. Henderson looked at Patterson's covered body, at Cross shivering in Angus's blankets. Fire was easier, until it wasn't. Aye, that's always the way. Easy methods work until conditions get hard. Then only the hard methods work. The rescue party loaded Cross onto an improvised stretcher for transport back to their camp. Patterson's body would have to wait. Moving it wasn't priority. Before leaving, Henderson asked Angus to explain the stone bed technique in detail. Other men needed to know this. Other men were dying unnecessarily because they didn't understand how to stay warm without fire. Angus walked Henderson through the entire process, explaining principles he'd learned from his grandfather and refined through 30 years of mountain winters. Stone selection. Flat, dense stones work best. River rocks are ideal. They're typically dense, have been smoothed by water action, and are often the right thickness. Avoid porous or layite stones, which can explode when heated. Each stone should be roughly dinner plate size and 3 to 4 inches thick. Thicker stones hold more heat but take longer to heat through. Thinner stones heat faster but cool faster. Bed construction. Arrange stones in a rectangle slightly longer and wider than your body. A single layer is sufficient. Stacking stones doesn't significantly improve performance because heat radiates from the top surface regardless of depth. Clear the ground beneath the stones of debris, but don't dig a pit. You want the stones at ground level or slightly above. Border wall. Build a low wall of additional stones around the perimeter, about 4 inches high. This wall contains the fire during heating and provides wind protection during sleep. The wall stones will also absorb heat and contribute to overnight warmth. Shelter. Build some form of overhead shelter to block wind and precipitation. Even a simple lean-to is sufficient. The shelter doesn't need to be warm, it just needs to prevent heat-robbing air movement over the stones. Heating process. Build a fire directly on the stone bed in the afternoon, several hours before you plan to sleep. Use enough wood to burn hot for 2 to 3 hours minimum. The goal is to heat the stones all the way through, not just the surface. Surface heat dissipates quickly. Core heat lasts for hours. A hot fire directly on the stones will raise their temperature to 400–600 degrees Fahrenheit. This is much hotter than you can sleep on, but that's intentional. You want the stones to be overheated initially so they're still warm 12 hours later. Preparation for sleep. When you're ready to sleep, ideally at least an hour after extinguishing the fire, sweep away all coals and ashes using a branch or broom. Remove all burning material. Even small embers can burn through bedding. Sweep thoroughly. Insulation layer. Cover the heated stones with a buffalo hide, canvas, or multiple layers of wool blankets. This layer serves 2 purposes. It protects you from direct contact with stones that are still too hot, and it retains heat by preventing air circulation. The insulation layer should be thick enough that you can lie on it comfortably without feeling excessive heat. Sleeping. Lie on the insulated stone bed as you would any bed. Cover yourself with blankets or furs. The stones will radiate heat upward through the insulation, keeping you warm from below. This is actually more efficient than warming from above, like blankets alone provide, because heat rising from below creates a warm microclimate around your body. Morning. By morning, the stones will be cool or slightly warm. You can reuse the bed by simply heating it again. The stones don't wear out or lose capacity. The same bed can be used for months or years. Henderson listened carefully, taking mental notes. The technique was simple but counterintuitive. American trappers heated themselves directly with fire, radiant heat from flames warming the side of the body facing the fire, while the other side stayed cold. Angus's method heated mass that then heated the entire sleeping surface evenly. The fire did its work during daylight hours when it could be safely tended. The sleeper benefited through the night when fire would require dangerous attention. How much warmer does the bed stay compared to ground temperature? Henderson asked. Depends on many factors. Stone mass, initial temperature, insulation quality, air temperature, wind. In last night's storm, 18 below high wind, my stones went from perhaps 400 degrees to perhaps 80 degrees over 12 hours. Still 60 degrees warmer than air temperature at their coolest. Comfortable sleeping temperature entire night. And Patterson and Cross, with their fire that kept blowing out. They had radiant heat when fire burned, no heat when fire died. Fire died many times. They cooled to air temperature every time, then had to rewarm. Body cannot sustain repeated cooling cycles. Eventually, core temperature drops too far to recover. They tried to relight the fire. You could hear them working at it all night. I heard them, knew what was happening, but storm was too severe. Couldn't help. If I'd left my shelter, might have died too. Best I could do was survive and tell others the method afterward. Henderson nodded slowly. I've been trapping for 8 years. Never heard of this technique. Never seen anyone use it. Is common in Scotland, in Scandinavia, in mountains of Europe, not common in America. Americans rely on fire too much. Fire is tool, but should not be only tool. Modern thermal analysis validates everything Angus understood intuitively. The stone bed technique works because of fundamental principles of heat storage and transfer. Thermal mass. Dense materials like stone have high thermal mass, meaning they can absorb and store large amounts of heat energy. A pound of granite can store approximately 0.2 BTUs per degree Fahrenheit. A 300-pound stone bed heated to 400 degrees above ambient temperature stores approximately 24,000 BTUs of energy, enough to provide several hundred BTUs per hour for many hours. Cooling rate. How quickly the stones cool depends on temperature differential, surface area, and insulation. Exposed stones in cold air cool relatively quickly. Insulated stones cool slowly. A well-insulated stone bed loses perhaps 1 to 2 degrees per hour during the night, meaning it stays warm for 10 to 14 hours before reaching ambient temperature. Radiant heat transfer. The heated stones radiate infrared energy in all directions. When a person lies on insulated stones, their body intercepts this radiant energy, receiving continuous heat input without any combustion or fuel consumption. This radiant heat is more efficient than convective heat from fire because it doesn't require air movement and doesn't heat unused space. Comparison to fire. A typical campfire produces approximately 30,000 BTUs per hour while burning, more than enough to keep a person warm, but only if you're close to it and only while it burns. The moment fire dies, heat production stops. Additionally, fire heats by convection, warming air that then warms you, which is inefficient because warm air rises and dissipates. Stone beds heat by radiation, which transfers energy directly to the body. The critical advantage. Fire requires continuous fuel input. Stone beds require fuel input only during the heating phase. In a 12-hour night, a fire might consume 80–120 pounds of wood. A stone bed consumes 30–40 pounds of wood during a 3-hour afternoon heating, then nothing. The stone bed is 3 to 4 times more fuel efficient while providing more consistent warmth. More importantly, stone beds work when fire doesn't. In high wind, heavy snow, or when fuel is wet or scarce, fire becomes unreliable or impossible. Stone beds, once heated, are immune to conditions. Wind doesn't blow away their heat. Snow doesn't extinguish them. They don't require dry fuel in the middle of the night. William Cross died on October 15th, one day after the storm. Despite Angus's efforts to warm him, despite the rescue party's rapid transport to their camp, the damage was too severe. His core temperature had dropped too low for too long. Frostbite had claimed not just fingers and toes, but had begun affecting deeper tissue. His heart stopped in the early afternoon while being transported. 2 deaths from one storm, 2 experienced trappers who'd survived multiple Rocky Mountain winters, dead because they'd relied on fire during conditions that made fire impossible. Angus helped bury both men in shallow graves marked with stone cairns. There was nothing else to be done. The mountains took men who made mistakes, and trusting fire completely was a mistake when fire could fail. Henderson stayed with Angus for 2 days, learning the stone bed technique in detail. He built his own bed at Angus's camp, heated it, slept on it through a cold but clear night, and experienced firsthand how it worked. By dawn, he was convinced. "I've been doing this wrong for 8 years, Henderson said. "Burning wood all night, waking up cold anyway, always worried about fire dying. This is better." "Is different," Angus corrected. "Not always better. Warm nights, mild conditions, fire is fine, easy, comfortable, no preparation needed. Stone bed is for when conditions might turn bad, for when fire might fail, is insurance, not replacement. But you use it every night. I'm old, cannot afford mistakes. Young man makes mistake, maybe survives anyway. Old man makes mistake, dies. So I don't make mistakes. I heat stones every day whether storm comes or not. Most nights, stones are unnecessary precaution. Then storm comes and stones save my life." Henderson nodded. "Preparation for the worst, not just the expected." "Aye, that's how you live to be old in these mountains. Prepare for worst, hope for best. The young ones," he gestured toward the fresh graves, "they prepared for normal and got killed by abnormal." Henderson returned to his own camp and immediately began teaching the stone bed technique to his partners. Over the following weeks, as trappers gathered at trading posts for autumn supplies, the story of Angus MacPherson's survival spread. 2 men dead, 1 man alive, all in the same camp, same storm, same night. The only difference, heated stones. Angus himself became a reluctant teacher. Men sought him out, asking for demonstrations, asking questions about stone selection. heating duration, insulation materials. He taught anyone who asked, not charging for knowledge that he considered common sense. By December 1847, stone beds were appearing throughout the Colorado and Wyoming trapping grounds. Not every trapper adopted the technique. Some considered it too much work, some didn't believe it would work, some simply preferred the familiar comfort of fire. But enough did that the technique became established knowledge. The results were measurable. The winter of 1847-48 was harsh, with multiple severe storms. Mortality among trappers who used stone beds was significantly lower than among those who didn't. Men who had backup heating survived storms that killed fire-dependent men. The evidence accumulated with each blizzard. By the 1850s, stone bed construction was standard knowledge among experienced Rocky Mountain trappers. The technique appeared in written guides, was taught at trading posts, was passed from veteran to greenhorn as essential survival information. Angus's grandfather's Highland technique had become American frontier wisdom. As the technique spread, trappers developed variations suited to different conditions and preferences. The trench bed. Instead of building on the surface, some trappers dug a shallow trench, lined it with stones, and heated the entire trench. This provided better wind protection and allowed the sleeping surface to be below ground level, where temperature was slightly warmer. The trench walls also retained heat, creating a warm microclimate. The double-decker. Some trappers built 2 layers of stones with an air gap between them, theorizing that trapped hot air would provide additional insulation. Results were mixed. The technique worked, but wasn't significantly better than a single thick layer of stones. The fire-maintained bed. Rather than heating stones during the day and sleeping on stored heat, some trappers positioned their stone beds adjacent to fire pits, allowing fire warmth to continuously reheat the stones throughout the night. This hybrid approach combined the benefits of both methods, but required more fuel. The communal bed. For groups traveling together, larger stone beds could accommodate multiple sleepers. A bed 8 feet by 8 feet could hold 3 or 4 men, and the combined body heat plus stored stone heat kept everyone warm with minimal fuel. The permanent installation. At established camps or cabins, trappers built permanent stone beds that remained in place for years. These beds became valued camp amenities, one of the first things established when setting up winter quarters. The emergency bed. Experienced trappers learned to recognize natural stone surfaces that could be used as improvised stone beds. A flat rock outcropping, heated with fire for an hour, could provide emergency overnight warmth without constructing anything. This knowledge saved lives when trappers were caught in unexpected weather without time to build proper shelters. Modern survival training validates the stone bed technique. Military survival courses teach variations of thermal mass heating for situations where fire is impractical or impossible. Wilderness survival instructors demonstrate heated rock beds as emergency shelter options. The physics are well understood. Heat capacity. Stone has a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.2 BTU lbrdgf. A 300-pound stone bed heated 350 degrees above ambient temperature stores approximately 21,000 BTUs. Released over 12 hours, this provides approximately 1,650 BTUs per hour, roughly equivalent to the heat output of a small electric space heater. Surface temperature curve. A stone bed heated to 500 degrees and covered with insulation follows a logarithmic cooling curve. It cools quickly at first, when the temperature differential is highest, then more slowly as it approaches ambient. A well-insulated bed remains above body temperature, 98.6 degrees, for approximately 8 to 10 hours, and remains warmer than ambient for 12-14 hours. Radiant heat efficiency. The human body loses heat through 4 mechanisms: radiation, about 40%, convection, about 30%, evaporation, about 20%, and conduction, about 10%. A heated surface beneath the body primarily addresses radiation loss and conduction loss, together about 50% of total heat loss. This is why stone beds are so effective. They address the largest heat loss mechanism. Comparison studies. Field studies have compared overnight body temperature maintenance between fire-heated camps and stone bed camps. Subjects sleeping on properly heated stone beds maintained higher average core temperatures than subjects sleeping near fires that required maintenance. The stone bed provided more consistent warmth with fewer temperature fluctuations. Angus MacPherson continued trapping until 1859, when he was 65 years old. He survived 12 more Rocky Mountain winters after the October 1847 storm, never once suffering serious cold injury. He attributed his longevity to simple practices, always having backup plans, never trusting any single method completely, and preparing for worst-case conditions even when best case seemed likely. He taught the stone bed technique to an estimated 200 men over his final 12 years of trapping. Some learned well and survived conditions that would otherwise have killed them. Others ignored the teaching and paid with their lives. The mountains were unforgiving teachers, but they taught the same lesson repeatedly. Preparation saved lives, and assumptions killed. Angus retired to a small cabin in Santa Fe in 1859, where he lived until his death in 1867, at age 73. His obituary in the Santa Fe Weekly Gazette made no mention of stone beds or Highland survival techniques. It simply noted that Angus MacPherson had been a trapper for 40 years and had survived longer than most men who followed that dangerous profession. The stone bed technique he'd introduced to American trapping culture outlived him by decades. The method was still being taught in wilderness survival courses in the 1920s. It appeared in Boy Scout manuals, military training documents, and mountaineering guides throughout the 20th century. The principle that thermal mass can store heat for gradual release became fundamental to understanding how humans survive cold conditions. The graves of William Cross and Samuel Patterson were eventually lost to history, two more unmarked burials in mountains full of unmarked burials. Their deaths became statistics in the brutal mortality records of the Rocky Mountain fur trade. What survived was the lesson their deaths taught. Fire is not warmth. Fire is a method of producing warmth, one method among several. When conditions allow, fire works well. It's controllable, scalable, and provides light as well as heat. When conditions turn against fire, high wind, wet fuel, no fuel, conditions requiring sleep, other methods become necessary. Angus MacPherson understood this because his culture had learned it over centuries of Highland survival. Scottish shepherds had discovered that heated stones could keep a man warm through nights when fire was impossible. They'd refined the technique through generations of use, and Angus had inherited that refinement. American trappers, coming from cultures where fire was always available, had never developed equivalent knowledge. They relied on fire exclusively because fire had always worked. When fire stopped working, they died. The stone bed technique wasn't primitive, it was sophisticated, a refined application of physical principles that happened to use simple materials. It required understanding thermal mass, heat transfer, insulation, and timing. It required planning ahead, heating stones hours before they'd be needed. It required discipline to maintain the practice, even on nights when fire would have been easier. Everyone called Angus's stone bed primitive because it used rocks instead of flames. They saw old technology and assumed inferior technology. But old technology that works is superior to new technology that fails. Rocks that kept a man warm were better than fire that blew out. Two men died believing fire would save them. One man lived because he knew that sometimes the primitive way is the only way that survives. The campsite where Patterson and Cross died and Angus survived was used by trappers for another 15 years before the fur trade declined and the mountains emptied. Men who knew the story would sometimes camp there deliberately, using Angus's original stone bed that remained in place long after he'd left. By the 1880s, the site was abandoned. The lean-to collapsed, the stone bed buried under years of fallen leaves and forest debris. Today, somewhere in the Colorado high country, those stones still lie where Angus placed them in October 1847, a flat rectangle of river rocks that once held enough heat to save a man's life, while two others froze 20 feet away. The stones don't know the story they're part of. They don't know that they made the difference between life and death on one terrible October night. They're just rocks, arranged by a Scotsman who remembered what his grandfather taught him about staying warm when fire wasn't possible. But the lesson those stones represent endures. Thermal mass works. Stored heat works, backup systems work, preparation for the worst works. And sometimes the most primitive seeming solution is actually the most reliable solution, proven by centuries of survival in conditions that killed men who relied on more sophisticated methods. Everyone mocked Angus MacPherson's primitive stone bed. They called it old-fashioned, called it unnecessary, called it the kind of thing savages and old-timers fussed over. Real men built fires and kept them burning. Then the storm came, the fires blew out, the real men froze, and the old Scotsman with his primitive stones cooked breakfast the next morning, warm and rested, alive because he'd trusted knowledge that was old when America was still a British colony. Sometimes primitive is just another word for proven, and sometimes the person everyone calls old-fashioned is the only person who survives.